They tell you the three greatest minds in England once sat at this very table, trading wine and wit by candlelight. There is only one problem. By the time that meeting was supposed to have happened, one of these men was already dead, and another was locked behind stone. Look there, that ring your cup just left on the wood, pale, wet, already fading at the edges. Give it an hour and you'd never know it was there at all. That is most of history, if you want my honest opinion on the matter. A mark left by something warm, slowly disappearing, until somebody decides the wrong memory is warmer. Now, you asked me about pubs and writers, and I could tell you a dozen small true things that would bore you by closing time. Instead, I am going to tell you about the most famous room in English literature, a room that may never have held the people we think it held. Picture it with me. London, somewhere past the turn of the 17th century. Narrow streets east of St. Paul's, the houses leaning in close enough overhead that the rain barely reaches the cobbles before it has already passed between the gutters of two roofs. Candlelight behind leaded glass. Inside a private room. Heavy oak, rush matting. The particular smell of beeswax and spilled Canary wine and ink that has not quite dried. At the table, men with these sort of minds that make other men nervous. Papers pushed to one side. A quill resting where someone set it down mid-argument. Cups refilled by a landlord who knows better than to listen too closely to what is said in that room, because some of what was said in that room could cost a man his liberty, his place, or his future, depending on who happened to overhear it. This is the Mermaid Tavern, and the story, as it is usually told, goes like this. William Shakespeare sat at that table. So did Christopher Marlowe, sharp and dangerous, and already half a legend in his own short lifetime. So did Sir Walter Raleigh, soldier, courtier, the sort of man who founded clubs the way other men founded fortunes. Wine flowed. Wit flew across the table like something thrown in earnest. Some of the brightest names of the English Renaissance, all under one low Jacobean ceiling, shaping the language we still speak. It is a beautiful image. I will grant it that much. I have told it myself, on quieter nights, to listeners who wanted nothing more than the warmth of it. But you did not come here for warmth alone, did you? Here is where the story starts to wobble, if you look at it properly. Christopher Marlowe was killed in the spring of 1593. Not in a tavern, not over wine. A private house, a dispute over a bill, and then he was simply gone. Years before the Mermaid's famous literary circle is ever reliably recorded as meeting at all. And Raleigh, the man who is supposed to have founded the very club that gathered round that table. In the summer of 1603, when this legendary fellowship is said to have begun, Sir Walter Raleigh was not sitting in any candlelit room with a cup in his hand. He was locked in the Tower of London, accused of treason, with rather more pressing matters on his mind than wit and wine. So there is your room, a dead man and a prisoner, both seated comfortably at a table that, according to the calendar, neither of them could possibly have reached. Strange thing, isn't it? How a story can feel so warm and still be lying to you. Settle yourself a moment longer. There is more wine yet, and more truth underneath the legend than you might expect. Once we pull back that painted sign above the door and have a proper look at what was really sitting in the dark behind it. The rain has not eased, nor has the matter. So let us have the thing itself. The Mermaid Tavern was real. That much you can set down as solid fact and not worry about it shifting under you. It stood in Cheapside, doors opening onto Bread Street on one side and Friday Street on the other, in the thick of London's mercantile heart, not far from the shadow of Old St. Paul's. The earliest mention anyone has found comes from 1428, in the will of a vintner named John Toker, who left his apprentice a mansion he called the Mermaid in Bread Street. Already a substantial place, you notice. Already worth naming in a dying man's last instructions. By the time our story properly begins, it was no common alehouse. No sour alehouse crush. No common bench where every stranger heard your business. This was an expensive house with private rooms behind closed doors, the sort of place wealthy merchants and lawyers from the Middle Temple chose precisely because nobody outside could hear what was being said inside. And it was not a gentle place either, whatever the candlelight might suggest. In March of 1600, a gang of well-born troublemakers, calling themselves the Damn Crew, led by a restless knight named Sir Edmund Bainham, were turned out of the Mermaid at midnight. They did not go quietly. Blades were drawn in the street, and the city watch found themselves with rather more trouble than a curfew usually brings. The matter ended up before the Star Chamber itself. So, fine wine, fine company, and men who carried steel and were not afraid to use it. London has never much minded mixing the two. Now, if you want the true ghost of that tavern, the one who actually belongs at the table, you can stop looking for Shakespeare for a moment and look instead for Ben Jonson. Jonson belongs there the way the timber belongs to the building. Bricklayer turned playwright, a man who had killed an actor in a duel and talked his way out of the gallows with a verse of Latin, learned and loud and entirely at home wherever wine and argument met. He wrote of the Mermaid's Canary wine himself, fondly, in a poem inviting a friend to supper, and his friend Francis Beaumont, the playwright, wrote back of words spoken there that were nimble and full of subtle flame. That is not legend. That is a man remembering an actual room. Around Jonson gathered a real fellowship, with a real name, faintly absurd in the way these things always are once you write them down. The fraternity of Sireniacal Gentlemen. The Sirenics, some called them. We know they existed because in 1615, the traveller Thomas Coryate, halfway across India, wrote letters home addressed quite formally to the High Seneschal of that worshipful fraternity that met the first Friday of every month at the sign of the Mermaid in Bread Street. Beaumont was there. So was the poet John Donne and the scholar John Selden, and others whose names matter less than the simple fact that they gathered regularly at that table on documented evenings with documented wine. So, a real club, a real landlord too, a vintner named William Jonson, who took the place over around the turn of the century. Now here is where I have to be careful with you, because this next part is the part London most wants to believe, and it is also the part that will not quite hold. There is no document anywhere, not a letter, not a diary, not a single contemporary scrap that places William Shakespeare at that table drinking with the rest of them. None. And yet there is one link so close it aches. In March of 1613, Shakespeare bought the Blackfriars Gatehouse for £140. A legal matter, trustees needed to manage the inheritance properly. One of the men he chose, one of the men he trusted with his money and his name on a sealed document, was William Jonson, citizen and vintner of London, the landlord of the Mermaid. So Shakespeare knew him, trusted him enough to put his signature beside his on a property deed, close enough to lean across that bar and ask after the wine, and still, frustratingly, not close enough to prove he ever sat in that private room at all. 50 years later, a historian named Thomas Fuller could not resist filling that silence. He wrote of wit combats between Shakespeare and Jonson at the Mermaid. Jonson built high like a Spanish galleon, slow but loaded with learning, Shakespeare smaller and quicker, darting in with the tide. A lovely image, worth remembering as exactly what it is. Tradition, set down half a century after the fact, not a thing anyone present ever wrote, and the other two names that started this whole tale. Marlowe never sat at that table at all. A blade ended his evening in a private house at Deptford in 1593, years before this Jacobean circle ever properly formed, over nothing grander than an argument about a bill. And Raleigh, who later writers insisted had founded the whole club in 1603, spent that very year behind the walls of the tower, fighting for his life rather than founding a fellowship. That story, as it happens, came from a man named William Gifford, writing 2 centuries later in 1816, rather taken with the idea of gentlemen's clubs and not especially careful with his dates. So look at the table now properly, the way it actually stood. Jonson is there, solid as the oak beneath him. Beaumont beside him. The Sireniacs, real and recorded, raising their cups on the first Friday of the month. Shakespeare hovers somewhere near the doorway, known to the landlord, never quite seated. Marlowe is already 20 years gone, and Raleigh is behind stone, listening to a different kind of silence altogether. A fine room still, just not the room we were promised. The fire has dropped to embers now, and the rain outside has softened to something gentler, more like breath than weather. Shakespeare himself went quietly in the end. Stratford, the 23rd of April, 1616. No record of what carried him off. No deathbed scene anyone bothered to write down at the time. And yet even his death could not escape a tavern-shaped story. Decades later, the vicar of Stratford, a man named John Ward, noted in his diary that Shakespeare had a merry meeting with Ben Jonson and the poet Michael Drayton, and drank rather too freely of it, and died of a fever caught that night. Treat that the way you would treat any good rumour told long after the fact. It comes from a man who arrived in Stratford well after Shakespeare was in the ground, working from local memory rather than anything he witnessed himself. True or not, it tells you something all the same. Even at the very end of his life, England could not quite let Shakespeare leave a room without a cup in his hand. Then came September of 1666. You know the shape of that fire, even if you have never heard the details. It started small, as these things do, and within days it had taken Cheapside whole. Bread Street, Friday Street, the old tangle of timber, plaster, signboards, and overhanging rooms, burned until there was nothing left to burn. The Mermaid went with it. Whatever private rooms had held that real fellowship, whatever table Jonson and Beaumont and the Sireniacs had actually sat at, was reduced in a few nights to ash and a street plan that men would later rebuild from memory, not from the thing itself. And here is the strange mercy of it, if you can call it that. Once the walls were gone, nobody could hold the legend up against the room and find it wanting. There was no door left to point at and say, he was never seen walking through that one. No table left to measure the seating against the calendar. The proof had burned along with the evidence against it. And into that emptiness, other men were only too glad to walk. William Gifford, writing his account of Jonson's life in 1816, was the one who handed Raleigh his place at the founder's seat. Working from old notes he read rather more generously than the facts allowed. The Romantics took it further still. Keats wrote of the Mermaid as a kind of heaven for dead poets, a room beyond the world where Jonson and his fellows might drink forever undisturbed. Other writers, later still, folded Marlowe in beside them. because a trinity is a tidier shape than the truth ever managed to be. I would not call them liars. Not exactly. They were doing what people have always done with an empty room, filling it with the company they wished had been there. That is the thing about the Mermaid Tavern. If you take only one thing from tonight, it does not matter so much because every great man of the age sat at that table. Most of them did not. It matters because we wanted them to so badly that we rebuilt the room in our heads once the real one was gone, and we have never quite stopped furnishing it since. Some pubs keep their history written down in ledgers. Rents paid, ale brewed, names recorded in a steady hand. Others keep it in their beams, in the marks left by centuries of hands and boots and smoke. The Mermaid kept hers in absence. Once there was nothing left to contradict the story. The story simply walked in and made itself at home. So here, raise what is left in your glass with me before the fire goes down any further. Not to the Mermaid as the place where every legend happened, because it was not, and you and I both know it now. Raise it instead to the place where English memory learned how to drink with its ghosts, and how to lie to itself a little, and how to keep doing both for 400 years without ever quite letting either one go. Mind the door on your way out. There is a sign above it somewhere, faded past reading. Whatever was painted on it once, somebody, somewhere, has already decided to remember it for you. You've been listening to British Pub Lore. Mind how you go.